Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Kindly support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making such audiobooks for you. The Muslim Conquest of Persia by Lieutenant General A.I. Akram. This book tells in detail about the Arab conquest of Persia, also known as the Arab conquest of Iran, during the Rashidun Caliphate from 633 to 654 AD. This conquest brought the fall of the Sassanid Empire, which was in power for over 4 centuries, while rivaling its neighbor, the Eastern Roman Empire of Byzantine. Start of Chapter 7. The Eve of Qadisiyyah. From the brief description of the Persian advance in the preceding chapter, it might appear that it was an uneventful move. Actually, it was not. There were events in the form of raids and patrol clashes. Rustam had hardly arrived at Najaf when Saad sent a large foraging party, which went to Istimia, a town above Najaf, and collected a large flocks of sheep. But Rustam came to know of the raid in time and dispatched a cavalry detachment after the raiders. The Persian cavalry succeeded in intercepting the Muslims, who now found themselves in a tight corner. But luckily for them, Asim bin Amr arrived upon the scene and drove the Persians away, whereafter the flocks were brought in safely to the Muslim camp. Asim then went on to raid other places with success, and such was the fear which his name evoked in the Persian mind, that on many occasions Persian detachments seeing him coming, just moved out of his path and let him pass. A few days after the above raid, Rustam started his steady, methodical advance to the battle area, and it was when Jalinus got to Kharara with the advance guard that occurred the incredible one-man raid of the apostate chief, who was once known as Tulayha, the impostor. Saad was not aware of the arrival of the Persians at Kharara and wished to get information about Persian locations and movements. Consequently, he sent 2 officers, both ex-apostates, Amr bin Madi Karib and Tulayha bin Khawaylad, with instruction to find out all they could and get prisoners for interrogation. Both set off with detachments at dusk, but after crossing the river Atiq, separated. Amr going left and Tulayha going right. They had not gone far when Saad decided to have another in command of both those officers, and sent Qas bin Hubayra of the Bani Asad with 100 men to follow and take the 2 officers under command. Qas caught up with Amr, but by now Tulayha had moved elsewhere. Qas and Amr marched on to contact the Persians. When they got near the Persian camp at Kharara, approaching it from the west, Qais asked Amr what he intended to do. Amr replied that it was his intention to raid the nearest part of the Persian camp. With just these few men? Qais asked in amazement. Yes, replied Amr. You are putting the Muslims to a task for which they do not have the requisite strength, Qais asserted. By Allah, I forbid you, and that is that. Amr turned upon him in indignation. And who are you to say so? And that is that. I have been appointed commander over you, Qais replied calmly. And even if I were not, I would not permit you to launch your raid, and that is that. The men who were with Qais affirmed that he had been appointed commander by Saad over Amr and Tulayha. Amr took it badly. It was a great come down for him, He was the prince of the Yemen and could claim without dispute to be one of the highest nobles of the Arab race. Madi Karib bin Saf bin Zi Yazan of the tribe of Mazhij had defeated the Christian viceroy of Abyssinia in the Yemen with Anushirwan's help. On Anushirwan's behalf during the last few years of Anushirwan's reign. This had ended Abyssinian rule in the Yemen, and as a reward for his services, Anushirwan had made Madi Karib king of the Yemen. But 4 years later, the new king was assassinated by an Ethiopian, and Anushirwan appointed a Persian governor to rule the Yemen as a province of the Persian Empire. This Amr was a son of that Madi Karib. The family had followed the Jewish faith, but in 9 Hijri, Amr led a delegation of his tribe to Medina and accepted Islam. In 11 Hijri, upon the death of the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Amr apostatized, like everyone else, but did not oppose the Muslims in battle. He was eventually taken prisoner and brought before Caliph Abu Bakr, who pardoned him, and he became a Muslim again. When Umar raised the ban on the use of apostates in the Holy War, Umar with his followers went to Syria and fought with distinction under Abu Ubaidah. He took part in the Battle of Yarmouk, in which he lost an eye. A skillful warrior and a capable officer, he was noted for his wit and his knowledge of Arab tribes. And although quite old, he was immensely strong and was known as Abu Sor, father of the bull. And now he was being put in his place by Qais bin Hubayra. The discipline of this army was strict, and orders were obeyed without question. But Umar could not help blurting out, "By Allah, O Qais, the time that you are commander over me is truly a bad time. I would rather revert from your fate to my original one, and fight until death than serve under you a second time." Qais challenged Amr to say the same before Saad, and Amr said he would. On their return to camp, both went to Saad and complained about each other, but Saad succeeded in making peace between them, and Amr conceded that his plan of raiding a large enemy camp with a handful of men was, militarily, far from sound. Saad chided him. "O Amr, I prefer the safety and well-being of our men to the destruction of 100 of them in fighting 1,000 of the enemy. I thought you knew better than to throw 100 men in action against a large force of Persian cavalry." Tulayha, on separating from Amr, moved with his men on a route from the right in the direction of Najaf. There was bright moonlight and movement was easy, but he had hardly gone 4 or 5 miles when he came upon the Persian captain at Kharara, from the lights and noise of which it was evident that a very large force was encamped here. This was Chalinus with the Persian advance guard. Some of Tulayha's men, awed by the Persian camp, said, "Return to the commander. He believed that the enemy was in Najaf when he sent us. We must let him know." Others said, "Let us return so that the enemy does not know that we are here." Tulayha insisted that they go on, and when asked what he intended to do, said that he would enter the camp and gather information as per the instructions of the commander. "I shall risk my life and, if necessary, die," he asserted. Then his men, who were not apostates, turned against him, and this was easy to do because Tulayha's past guilt of apostasy put him in a vulnerable position. They did not go near him because he was a dangerous man to tackle in combat, but they gave him a tongue-lashing. "No doubt you wish to join them," they sneered. "You are a man with treachery in his heart, and Allah will never guide you aright because you killed Ukasha bin Mihsan. Come back with us." "Your hearts are filled with fear," Tulayha retorted. Thereupon his men left him and returned to the camp where they informed Sa'd of what had happened. Tulayha bin Khuwaylid was a remarkable man, an able and shrewd chief of the Bani Asad. He was also a poet and a soothsayer and had commanded respect in Arabia during the days of the ignorance. When the Holy Prophet ﷺ migrated to Medina, he became one of the most vicious enemies of Islam. He commanded a contingent of the Bani Asad as part of the coalition of infidel tribes, which fought the Muslims at the Battle of the Ditch. Later he sided with the Jews in the campaign of Khaybar, but was worsted by the Muslims. In 9 Hijri he accepted Islam when all other Arabian tribes did so, but his conversion was a matter of political expediency rather than a genuine change of heart. Shortly before the Holy Prophet's death in 11 Hijri, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Tulayha renounced his allegiance to the Muslim state and declared himself a prophet. He was an impostor. He went so far as to forbid prostration during prayer, and his followers prayed behind him without prostration. Many clans of north-central Arabia joined him, and soon he had become the second most powerful enemy of Islam, the first being Musaylima the liar, also a false prophet. Tulayha's reign as chief of chiefs and prophet did not last long. He was defeated in battle by Khalid bin al-Walid at Buzakha, but before that battle he killed in single combat a Muslim named Ukasha bin Mihsan, who was a much-loved companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and a much-admired warrior. After his defeat by Khalid he fled to Syria. Later, however, he returned to Arabia and re-entered the faith, but many Muslims held his guilt against him, and their resentment increased when he showed none of the humility which was expected of a penitent, especially one who had killed the noble Ukasha. But that was now a matter of the past, and Tulayha was a Muslim again, and anxious to redeem himself in the holy war. Deserted by his men, Tulayha moved on and got nearer the Persian camp. He tied his horse at a safe distance and strolled into the camp. He carried out a thorough reconnaissance of the camp and shortly before dawn began to pick his way out of the sea of tents. He had not gone far from the center of this camp when he came upon a beautiful small white tent, outside which stood a horse such as he had never seen. Tulayha took the horse, but before leaving, cut the ropes of the tent and moved on as the tent collapsed upon its sleeping occupant. Some distance further on he saw another nice tent and another fine horse. He did the same and moved on again. At the edge of the camp, he brought down a third tent and took his third horse. And now he was in the open. When bringing down the first tent, as also the second, Tulayha did not know that he was disturbing the slumber of not one man, but 1,000 men. The Persians had a large number of gladiators chosen for their size, strength, and ferocity. Physically powerful and without fear, these men were trained in the arts of combat to such a degree that they could be regarded as the most perfect specimens of the fighting man. They were the champions of the army, heroes of Persia, and took the heaviest toll of enemy lives. They would die in battle rather than accept defeat. Because of their strength and prowess, they were considered the equals of 1,000 men and were called as such, Hazar Mard. A Persian general engaged in battle could send such a champion to the part of the front which needed reinforcement, and claimed that he had sent a force of 1,000 men. And such was the performance of these fearsome fighters, that the presence of each one of them in combat was acknowledged as the presence of 1,000 men. One such champion, there may have been others, is known to have faced Khalid bin al-Walid in a fierce duel. So Tulayha brought down the first tent on a Hazar Mard. Perhaps he chuckled at the idea of a man lying under it, but in the awkward folds of the collapsed tent struggled 1,000 men. The 1,000 men were not assumed, not about to forgive the perpetrator of the indignity. However, by the time the Hazar Mard got out, donned his armor and weapons and found another horse, Tulayha was doing the same to a second Persian, also 1,000 men, whose reaction was no more cheerful than that of the first. Tulayha, now outside the Persian camp, mounted his own horse and began his return journey, in the pale light of dawn, leading the 3 captured horses. He had not gone far when his 3 victims caught up with him, followed by a large number of Persian soldiers, who came out to see what their champions would do to the intruder. Tulayha was a brilliant fighter and a fearless man, in fact the only person he feared, and of him he had once lived in mortal dread, was Khalid bin al-Walid. And now, refusing to flee, he turned to meet his pursuers while the Persians, true to the traditions of Persian chivalry, came at him one at a time, in the order in which their tents had been brought down and their horses taken. This must have been like a tournament of knights, except that the contest was in deadly earnest, and not a game. The first Hazar Mard charged at Tulayha with his lance, and was about to make his thrust, when Tulayha sidestepped with his horse and evaded the charge. And as the Persian hurtled past him, Tulayha swung round in his saddle and plunged his spear in the back of his adversary, breaking the back. In a few moments, 1,000 men lay dead at the feet of the Muslim's horse. Next the second Persian champion charged, and Tulayha executed exactly the same maneuver with exactly the same result. Another 1,000 Persians perished in combat. The third Persian was somewhat intimidated by the fate of the first 2, but as a proud Persian warrior, had to vindicate his honor. He too charged with a lance, and the Persian spectators saw a repetition of the earlier duels, except that Tulayha did not send his spear home into the receding back of his opponent. Tulayha had just remembered the instructions of Saad to get a prisoner, and decided to take this man alive. He rode after the Persian demanding a surrender, and the Persian, knowing that his life had been spared by his adversary, and that the chances of his getting away alive were slim, surrendered to the Muslim. Tulayha made the Persian ride in front of him, and returned to the Muslim camp. Other Persians who had seen his performance in combat wisely stayed out of his path. An anxious Saad had awaited all night the return of Tulayha, or news of him. His return now in this strange manner, leading a fine-looking Persian soldier and 3 magnificent horses, came as a relief but left him perplexed. "Woe to you," he said to Tulayha. "What have you been doing?" "I entered their camp," replied Tulayha, "and saw much during the night. I caught one of the best of them, and here he is." An interpreter was sent for, who questioned the Persian prisoner, and it was from him that the Muslims learnt that the 2 men killed by Tulayha were Hazar Mards, that they were also brothers and the prisoner himself was their cousin. He explained that he had seen war ever since he was a boy, and had fought and defeated many champions in his military career. But he had never seen a fighter like Tulayha, and he gave information regarding the Persian army camped across the Muslim front. At the end of the interrogation, the Persian became a Muslim and fought valiantly beside Tulayha in the battle that was to follow. After this episode, as the Persian army advanced and camped in its forward position, a number of raiding parties were sent out by the Muslims, and more prisoners were taken and more information gathered. Tulayha and Qais bin Hubayra played a prominent role in these raids. There were also several skirmishes which had the effect of keeping everybody on his toes. When the Persians had settled down in their various camps on the east bank of the Atiq, Rustam carried out a number of reconnaissances. He rode down along the river as far south as opposite Qafan, where the rightmost Muslim unit was camped. He saw every place where a crossing could be made, and looked across at every plain on which a battle could be fought. On his way back to his camp, he stopped at the main bridge and looked across the river at the Muslim warriors standing on the west bank. Free movement was possible for either army on its own side of the river, and since battle had not yet been joined, one side did not interfere with the movements of the other. Rustam had in mind the possibility of using diplomatic measures to rid Persia of the invaders without bloodshed, and decided to gauge the temper and attitude of the Muslims before initiating formal talks. He sent a messenger across the river to fetch the Muslim commander at the bridge. The Muslim general here was Zuhra bin al-Hawiyya, who had commanded the Muslim advance guard on the march of the army from Arabia, and was now in command of the covering troops deployed on the river line. Without hesitation, Zuhra walked over the bridge and came face to face with Rustam, who awaited him with an interpreter. Rustam was the first to speak. "You are our neighbors," he began, "and many of you lived within our empire. We were good to them as neighbors and saved them from sufferings. We bestowed favors upon them and protected them from the people of the wilderness. We allowed their flocks the use of our pastures and gave them provisions from our land. We did not hinder their trade in any commodity of our land, and with us they found their subsistence and a contented living." "What you say is true," replied Zuhra. "So indeed it was. But we are not as they, and our objectives are different to theirs. We have come to you seeking not this world but the next. Those of us who came to you in the past submitted to you humbly, seeking what you possessed in your hands. Then Allah Most High sent us a prophet who called us to his Lord, and he answered the call. And he said to his prophet, on whom be the blessings of Allah and peace, I have given these people sovereignty over those who have not accepted my religion, and I shall punish those with these. I shall give these the upper hand for so long as they remain faithful to my religion. And it is the religion of truth. None turns away from it but suffers disgrace, and none clings to it but is exalted." "And what is this religion?" asked Rustam. "Its main pillar," said Zuhra, "upon which all else rests, is the declaration that there is none worthy of worship except Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and acceptance of what he has brought from Allah Most High." "How fine this seems! And what more?" "Turning the worshippers from the worship of man to the worship of Allah." "That too is fine. And what more?" "That all men are children of Adam and Eve, and therefore brothers one to another." "That too is fine," said Rustam as he continued his questioning. "Now suppose my people and I accept this faith. What would you do? Would you return? Yes, by Allah, Zuhra affirmed, and we shall never approach your land again except for trade and such things. Rustam had nothing more to say at this stage, and Zuhra returned to the west bank. The Persian general went back to his camp, lost in thought. For the next 3 weeks or so, there was no major movement of forces on either side of the river. A certain amount of raiding and patrolling went on, but the main activity of the two armies consisted of preparations for battle in a mood of tense expectation. Rustam knew that his army would have to cross the river and had his engineers ready for the task. On the Muslim side, the arrival of the Persians, which they had awaited for months and which fitted exactly with Saad's design, was received calmly. But the warriors did not like the close proximity of the Persian camps, which had the effect of restricting the space over which the Muslims could freely move. Some of them approached Saad and asked him to attack and push the Persians back, but Saad told them to await the decision of those who knew better. The Muslims did not have much to prepare, because a light mobile army like theirs was always prepared for battle. But they kept the Persians under surveillance and awaited the next Persian move. The next Persian move was a diplomatic one. Rustam was fully prepared for a general battle. But before that, he would make one final attempt at finding a solution other than military to the present problem. Consequently, he sent a messenger to Saad, asking him to send him an emissary for talks. Saad selected 7 Muslims, all known for their intelligence and maturity, and was going to send them all together. But at a conference with the 7, it was decided that only one man should be sent who would do all the talking necessary. Of the 7, Saad chose Rabi bin Amir as the envoy of Islam to Rustam. Rabi set off from the Muslim camp, crossed the bridge and made for the headquarters of the Persian commander-in-chief. The Persians were making the mistake, again and again, of regarding these Arabs as Arabs of the ignorance. A wild, poverty-ridden, disorganized people, almost barbarian, who would come to Persia seeking plunder or a living, and who were overawed by Persian pomp and splendor. They should have realized by now that these Arabs, upon their conversion to Islam, had become a new breed of men with an entirely different and more exalted set of values. But here again, the Persians committed the same error. They prepared to show the Arabs their gold and silver, their emblems of wealth and earthly magnificence. A court was set up for Rustam. The commander-in-chief donned his finest uniform, aglitter with precious stones, and sat on a wide gilded throne. Behind and on his flank stood the nobles of Persia and the high officers of the army, bedecked in all their finery, and surrounding them all were arrayed a large number of local Persian and Arab officials and lower subjects of the empire. Stretching away from the throne lay a splendid carpet, the length of which is said to have been 1 bowshot, but this is obviously an exaggeration. Over the carpet was strewn the finest cushions which the world of the time could produce, and all this was done to strike awe in the heart of the ambassador of Islam. The contrast with the ambassador of Islam was stunning. Rabi' bin Amir appeared at the court wearing a coat of shining mail, over which was wrapped a coarse woolen cloak, tied at the waist. Around his head was a veil, held by thongs of a camel's skirt, but which did not conceal his thick hair, which was done in 4 upstanding plaits, looking like the horns of an antelope. His sword hung at his side in a sheath of coarse cloth. Across his chest was strung his bow. On his back was slung a shield of cowhide, on the face of which was a brown spot like a loaf, and in his right hand he carried his spear, the handle of which was bound with leather strips. The ambassador of Islam, armed and equipped for battle, arrived at the edge of the great carpet mounted on a short, shaggy horse which looked badly in need of grooming. The Persians were more awed at the sight of their visitor than they had expected their visitor to be. Seeing him so roughly attired and armed like the commonest soldier, and fearing for their beautiful carpet, they asked him to dismount. Their fears were fully justified, for Rabi, in utter disregard of the looks of alarm and the pleas of his hosts, rode on to the carpet. When he had covered half the distance to Rustam, he dismounted. The Persians then asked the visitor to lay aside his arms, to which he replied, "I have not come to you to lay down my weapons at your command. You invited me, and if you do not wish me to come as I wish to come, I shall return." The Persians looked apprehensively at Rustam, wondering what would happen if the Muslim, armed as he was, should suddenly assault their commander-in-chief. But the Persian general said, "Let him come. He is but one man." Rabi now advanced towards Rustam, using his spear as a stake, and impervious to the horrified stares of the Persians, with every other step thrust the point of his spear into the carpet or into a cushion. Not one cushion remained in his path but was torn. On getting close to Rustam, he drove his spear into the earth through the carpet and sat down on the floor. When asked why he had sat on the floor, Rabi said, "We do not like to sit in your fashion." Then began a dialogue between the Persian general and the envoy of Islam. Rustam: "What message do you bring?" Rabi: "We have been sent by Allah to take worshippers out of the worship of man into the worship of Allah, to take them from the narrow bondage of the world into freedom, from the tyranny of other faiths into the justice of Islam. We have been sent with his religion to his creation, to call people to him. Whoever accepts Allah's religion, we accept his acceptance and return, leaving him and his land. As for him who rejects, we fight him until we get to that which is ordained by God." Rustam: "And what is ordained by God?" Rabi: "Paradise for those who die fighting the infidel, and victory for those who survive." Rustam: "I have heard what you had to say. Are you agreeable to postponing the decision for some time, so that you and we can ponder?" Rabi: "Yes. How much time do you wish? 1 day? 2 days?" Rustam: "No. We need more time. We need more time because we have to write to the leaders of the nation and to men of judgment." Rabi: "It is one of the traditions of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that we do not allow an enemy more than 3 days' grace before battle. So we shall keep away from you for 3 days in which you can reflect upon the matter and select one of the three: Islam, and we shall leave you and your land, or the Jizya, and we shall defend you unless you do not need our help in defense, or we shall fight you on the 4th day and not before the 4th day, unless you initiate operations. You have my word for this on behalf of my comrades and all those whom you see on your front." Rustam: "Are you their chief?" Rabi: "No, but the Muslims are like one body, and the lowest is equal to the highest." Here the conference ended and Rabi returned to the Muslim camp. Rustam was profoundly impressed by the Muslim ambassador and pondered deeply over his conversation with Rabi. He saw how futile it was to depend upon the appearances of the civilization and culture in which he had always believed, in the face of such pure, glowing faith and such simple earthy realism. The next day Rustam again sent a request to Saad for an emissary, and this time Saad picked Hudhaifa bin Mihsan, one of the group selected by him the day before. Hudhaifa approached Rustam's court in much the same manner as his predecessor had done, and when asked to dismount refused to do so on the grounds that they had invited him and they were the ones who needed the envoy. He rode over the carpet to Rustam's throne, again refused to dismount, and remained seated on his horse throughout the talks with the Persian commander-in-chief. Rustam started by asking why the envoy of the day before had not come, to which Hudhaifa replied, "Our commander treats us equally in enjoying favors and bearing hardships. This time it is my turn." Thereafter Hudhaifa offered the Persians the usual three options: Islam, the Jizya, and the sword, and without indulging in further discussion, turned his horse and ride away. Rustam and the Persians were struck by the confidence and easy dignity with which both the Muslim envoys had spoken, and their obvious contempt for the pomp and ceremony with which the Persians were trying to impress and browbeat the Muslims, whom they had considered as belonging to a lower order. Rustam felt dissatisfied with the talks which had been held so far. He had not really got into his stride, not really put himself across as he wished. And so on the following day he asked again for an emissary, and this time he received one of the most colorful of the Muslim officers, Mughira bin Shu'bah. Mughira was received at the bridge by Persian soldiers and escorted to Rustam's court. He had his hair parted twice, north, south, and east, west, and made into 4 plaits. On arrival at the court he crossed the carpet. It is not known whether on foot or on horseback, and on getting near Rustam, surprised everyone by rushing to the throne and sitting down upon it beside the Persian general. For a few brief moments the Persian officers stared at him in stunned silence. Then they sprang at him, pulled him off the throne, and shook him. Mughira fought to keep his seat on the throne, and in the struggle which followed protested. "We had heard of your forbearance, but I do not know of a people more devoid of it than you. We Arabs are all equal and one is not a slave to another. I had thought that you too would treat people as equals, just as we do. But what you have done makes it clear to me that some of you are lords over others. You shall not continue to enjoy authority. I have not come to you of my own accord. You invited me, and now I know the weakness of your position. You will surely be overwhelmed, for a state cannot endure which indulges in such behavior and such thinking." Rustam ordered his officers to release the envoy, who once again sat upon the throne. Then, seeing the look of disdain in the eyes of Rustam's brother, who stood beside him, Mughira said, "Do not look so, for by sitting here I do not gain in prestige, nor does your brother lose any." Order having been restored, Rustam tried to calm his visitor by explaining the behavior of his officers. "O Arab, on the outskirts of the empire certain things may happen of which the emperor does not approve but which he had to accept. He then sought to belittle the Muslims by comparing their weapons with the fine Persian ones. Looking at the short light arrows which protruded from Mughira's quiver, he asked, 'What do you do with these spindles?' 'We shoot them.' 'And why is your sword wrapped in rags?' 'It is clothed in rags, but it strikes like steel,' replied Mughira, drawing his sword and offering it to Rustam for inspection. It was actually an excellent blade. Having made his point, Mughira sheathed his sword, and now began the formal talks between him and the Persian. Rustam. Since time immemorial we have been established in the land, victorious over our enemies, leaders among nations. In no realm is there greatness such as ours, nobility and power such as ours. We conquered over all men, and none conquered over us, except for a day or two or a month or two, because of our sins. But when God had punished us sufficiently, He turned to us in kindness and restored to us our glory and to our enemy his suffering. Among the nations there was none as lowly as you. You lived in squalor and wretchedness, and we thought of you as nothing. When your land was struck by famine and you suffered from hunger, you came to our borders for succor, and we arranged dates and corn for you, and returned you to your land. I know that what brings you here is hardship in your land. I shall give your commander a set of clothes and a mule and 1,000 dirhams, and to every man among you 2 garments and a bag of dates. And you shall go away from us, for I have no desire to kill you or take you into captivity. Mughira, after praising Allah and invoking His blessings upon the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Lo, Allah is the creator of all things, and their sustainer. And whoever makes anything, it is in fact Allah who makes it. As for what you have said about yourself and your people, of victory over enemies, of power in the land and glory in the world, we are aware of it and do not deny it. Indeed, Allah made you great, and then reduced your power. As for what you have said about the poverty of our condition, and the wretchedness of our existence, and the discord of our hearts, we know that too and do not dispute it. But Allah was trying us, and we have now become His. Times change, and ever are people of misfortune turning to ease, and ever are people of ease falling into misfortune. Had you been thankful to Allah for what He had given you, the burden of the wrong that you have done would have been lightened. But ingratitude has altered your fine condition. Lo, Allah Most High sent us a prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Here he repeated what other envoys had said about the message of Islam and offered the usual 3 options. Rustam. And what will happen if you are killed? Mughira. Those of us who are killed will enter paradise, and those of you who are killed will go to hell. Rustam, in great anger. There can never be peace between us. By the sun as it rises, tomorrow morning I shall slay the whole lot of you. Mughira, quoting a Quranic verse. There is no power to change and no strength except with Allah. Got up and walked away from the throne. Rustam turned to a Persian officer and ordered him to accompany the envoy up to the bridge, and added, when he has crossed the bridge and got to his comrades, shout to him that I am an astrologer, that I have checked about him and that tomorrow he will lose an eye. The Persian officer accompanied Mughira as he rode to the bridge, and when the Muslim had crossed over to the west bank, conveyed the message as ordered by Rustam. Thereupon Mughira replied, You give me good news, but for my desire to fight infidels like you after this battle also, I would wish to lose the other eye too. The Persian standing on the east bank laughed, and then became thoughtful as the full import of Mughira's words penetrated their minds. Rustam asked for no more envoys. Saad, however, in his initial selection of delegates, had chosen 7 Muslims to represent him, and of these 4 remained. So on his own, upon the return of Mughira, he sent off these four to reason with Rustam and persuade him to accept Islam or the payment of the jizya. These four delegates were Busr bin Abi Ruhm, Arfaja bin Harsama, Qirfa bin Zahir, and Maz'ur bin Adi. Rustam welcomed the delegation in the hope that they had perhaps come round to his terms. He had much the same sort of approach, first belittling the Arabs on account of their past wretchedness, and then offering generous rewards if they would return to their desert homes. We are like the man who had a vineyard and saw a fox in it one day. He said, "What is a fox?" and let it be. But the fox called other foxes to the vineyard, and when they had all gathered in it, the owner closed the hole in the wall of the vineyard through which they had entered, and then killed all the foxes. And you are like the rat who found a jar of grain with a hole in it, and went through the hole. His friends called to him to come out, but he refused, and went on eating the grain until he became sleek and fat. Then he felt a desire to show his friends how beautiful he looked, but found that because of his bulk he could no longer get through the hole. So he complained to his friends of his distress and asked them how to get out. They said, "You are never going to get out of there until you become as you were when you went in. So starve yourself." The rat remained inside, starving himself and living in fear. But before he could return to his former thin state, the owner of the jar found him and killed him. And you are like the fly that saw a bowl of honey and said to his friends, "Whoever gets me to that honey shall have 2 dirhams." The other flies tried to stop him, but he went on to the honey and then into it. As he began to drown in the honey, he cried out, "Whoever gets me out of this honey shall have 4 dirhams." And you are like the fox who came into a vineyard, thin and starving, and began eating as God wished. The owner of the vineyard saw him and, pitying his condition, let him stay. But when the fox had been there for some time and grown big and fat, he turned wicked and started to destroy more grapes than he consumed. This angered the owner, who, along with his servants, took a big stick and came after him. The fox dodged them and ran to the hole in the vineyard wall through which he had come, but that hole was big enough for him only when he was thin, and now he was too fat to get through it. So the owner and his servants caught up with him and beat him with sticks until he was dead. You came, O Arabs, when you were thin, and now you are fat. See how you get out. The Arabs were not amused. They narrated the usual story about Allah and the Holy Prophet and offered the usual terms, emphasizing that what they sought most was the Persians' conversion to Islam. Rustam was now bored with such statements. He brought matters to a head by saying abruptly, "Will you cross the river to our side, or shall we cross to yours?" "You cross to our side," replied the Muslims. The envoys returned to the Muslim camp and informed Sa'd of how matters stood. Sa'd at once ordered preparations for occupation of battle positions. Rustam sent a messenger to Sa'd asking to be allowed to use the bridge, but Sa'd returned him with the reply, "No, we have captured it from you and shall not hand it back to you. Take the trouble to make a crossing other than this bridge." So far the reader has been able to follow with the aid of maps 3 and 4 the march of the two armies to the area of Qadisiyyah. Before we take up the deployment of the two forces and go into the narrative of this historic battle, it would be as well for the reader to get some idea of the terrain over which the battle was fought. What follows in subsequent paragraphs is a topographical description of the plain of Qadisiyyah and the area in its vicinity. The reader is advised to refer to maps 3 and 4 while studying this description. The plain of Qadisiyyah was bounded on the west and east by the trench of Sabur and the river Atiq respectively, the space between them being about 4 or 5 miles. The trench had been dug under the orders of the Emperor Sabur as a canal or large ditch and ran from Heath to Kazima on the Bay of Kuwait. It was built as an obstacle against Arab raiders from the desert and was filled with the water of the Euphrates taken at Heath, which eventually flowed into the Bay of Kuwait. Over the generations, the trench had suffered from neglect and silted up, but it was repaired in the 6th century AD by Anushirwan, who also built small forts along its length, manned by Persian garrisons which protected the empire from desert raiders. The trench was still there at the time of Qadisiyyah, but it was in a state of disrepair. The river Atiq, which no longer exists, took off from somewhere west of Najaf, from a region of marshes which it drained, and flowed past Khafan into the Euphrates. It was a sizable river, though not of the magnitude of the Euphrates. North of the plain of Qadisiyyah was a large lake, with 2 routes going along its sides, one from Qadisiyyah to Hira, and the other from Qadisiyyah around the left of the lake. South of Qadisiyyah lay a number of lakes stretching up to Walaja, which was a few miles below Olais. The plain was the only stretch of hard ground in the area big enough for a large-scale battle, and to the west, beyond the trench, it merged into the desert. Astride the trench lay the town of Uzeb. There was a castle here too, at the eastern end of the town, and along the eastern edge of the trench. Caliph Umar, to his instructions to Saad, had mentioned Uzeb, Uzeb-ul Hijanat, and Uzeb-ul Qawadis, and there were 2 Uzebs at the time, but we know only of one Uzeb, this one. It marked the very edge of the desert, and the castle was probably one of the larger forts built by Anushirwan. Information about Qadisiyyah itself is confusing. It is known that it was 4 miles east of Uzeb, but historians have also spoken of Qadis and Qudais, some saying that they were all different names of the same place, others that they were separate places. A detailed study suggests that there were 2 places, Qadisiyyah and Qudais, the first being the more important of the 2. The bridge over the Atiq on the route to Hira was known as the Bridge of Qadisiyyah, and Qudais was a smaller place on the Euphrates by the lower part of the plain. Just south of the castle and east of the trench ran a small valley known as Musharraq, and on the eastern edge of this valley stood the village of Ain Shams. These 2, the valley and the village, played no part in the battle except that the Muslim martyrs were buried in this valley. As soon as the Persian messenger returned with Saad's refusal to let the Persians use the bridge, a refusal which the Persians had anticipated, Rustam ordered his engineers to construct a dam over the river Atiq. Preparations for this work had already been made, stores and material gathered, and engineers briefed about the plan of construction. Rustam decided upon a dam in preference to a bridge because it would give him a wider crossing, needed by the vast army with its horses. Elephants and baggage would reduce the danger of the bridge being destroyed, while the Persians were on the enemy side. The site chosen for the dam was a mile above Qudais and 4 miles south of the bridge of Qadisiyyah, and would lead to the plain of Qadisiyyah on the west bank, which Rustam had selected as the battlefield. Before nightfall, Persian engineers started working on the dam. They must also have constructed some sort of spillway because the level of the water remained constant and no lake formed, but we have no knowledge of the engineering design involved in this construction. The Muslims, acknowledging the need for a Persian crossing to make a battle possible, did not interfere with the work of the engineers, but withdrew about a mile from the river bank. The dam was constructed of wood, earth, and coarse cloth. Work continued through the night, and some time after sunrise the dam was complete, affording the Persian army a great road across the river. The Persian crossing began at once. Troops, horses, elephants, and baggage were rushed over the dam, and units began to deploy on the west side, according to a plan already given out by Rustam, a short distance beyond the bank of the river. By midday, the major groups had occupied their positions for battle, though adjustments were still going on within the groups. As Rustam saw his warriors moving across the river, a great confidence welled up in his breast. "We shall break them into little pieces," he remarked. One of his officers added fervently, "If God wills it," whereupon Rustam snapped, "Even if he does not." The Persian army deployed with 5 corps, holding the front and 1 corps in reserve. The commanders of the corps and their location were as follows: Center, Rustam; left center, Birzan; right center, Jalinus; left wing, Mihran; right wing, Hormuzan; reserve, Bahman. The Persian army had a strength of 60,000 men, of which about half were deployed in the 3 parts of the center. The strength of other groups is not known. In the center also stood 15,000 noble-born Persians, who formed the hardcore of the army, and these in turn included 4,000 Persians from a group which had been settled in Qadisiyyah by Khusro's Pervez, but who had to leave their homes on the arrival of Saad in the region. All these 15,000 used chains to bind themselves to each other, the chain lengths being for 3, 5, 7, and 10 men. Contrary to general opinion, chains were used in the Persian army not for fear that the men would run away. There was no question of troops running away across the Atik, but as a sign of suicidal courage, indicating the men's willingness to die in battle rather than flee. The chains did have the effect of strengthening morale, but suffered from the grave drawback that in case of a reserve, the men could not get away and would fall an easy prey to a victorious pursuer. In any case, Rustam was not contemplating defeat, and by placing his army across the river, had already accepted a do-or-die battle. There were 33 war elephants in the Persian army, each mounted by several men armed with javelins and bows. These elephants formed the most important and most powerful element of the army, not only for their physical performance as fighting beasts, but also for the effect which they had of striking fear in the enemy ranks. Of the elephants, 18 were placed in the center and 7 and 8 in the 2 wings, and these beasts were used as squadrons rather than strung out along the entire front of about 5 miles. In the center of the elephants stood 2 huge ones, a white beast and a scabby one, who acted as leaders of their kind and who were expected to set the pace for other elephants. They were also used in time of peace as trainers of war elephants. Along with the deployment of the army, a human telegraph system to the capital was established. This was a peculiarly Persian communication system and is indicative of the sophistication of the Persian military organization. A line of men, chosen for their powerful voices, was placed at shouting distance all the way from the battlefield to the imperial palace in Ctesiphon. Every event on the battlefield was shouted by A to B, then by B to C, and C to D, and so on until the last man conveyed it to the emperor and his advisers. By this means, information regarding the progress of battle could be carried hundreds of miles in a few hours. By establishing the crossing downstream of the Qadisiyyah bridge, Rustam had shifted the battlefield southwards by a few miles. At the bridge, however, he left a cavalry detachment to prevent a Muslim tactical crossing during battle. Across from this Persian detachment, Saad also left a Muslim mounted group to watch the bridge, as he moved the bulk of his army down to face the Persians. A large throne-like seat was raised near the west bank, shaded by a small canopy for the Persian commander-in-chief. On this sat Rustam, wearing his armor and his weapons. Beside him waved the Tirafash Gavian, the great standard of the Sassanids, which had last been taken into action by Bahman at the Battle of the Bridge. From this seat Rustam had quite a good view of the battlefield which stretched before him, and while looking at the Persian formations taking shape, he suddenly remembered the dream which he had had earlier about Umar sealing the weapons of his warriors. The recollection infuriated him, and he swore, "Umar has eaten my heart. May God burn his." The Muslim preparation for battle began early in the night as soon as the site of the Persian crossing was known. Units and groups, organized on the basis of tribes and clans, sidestepped towards the south and in the morning moved into battle positions corresponding to and about a mile away from the Persian front. The deployment of the army in corps was similar to the Persian one, except that it had a depth of only 3 ranks. In each contingent, the first rank was formed by the cavalry. Behind it stood a line of men armed with swords and spears or javelins, and behind it stood a line of archers. The commanders of the corps and their location were as follows. Center, Saad, with Hammal bin Malik as commander of the infantry. Left center, Asim bin Amr. Right center, Zuhra bin al-Hawiyya. Left wing, Shurahbil bin Asamt. Right wing, Abdullah bin al-Mu'tim. Reserve, Salman bin Rabi'a. The Muslim army consisted of 30,000 men, in whose ranks were more than 300 companions, 700 sons of companions, and the most venerated of all, more than 70 veterans of the Battle of Badr. There were groups of Christian Arabs too in the army, who had joined Saad upon his arrival at Qadisiyyah, and of these a few had already accepted Islam, while the remainder would do so after the battle. And in this army also served some Persian officers and men who had left the Persian Empire, and attracted by the new message of Islam, thrown in their lot with the Muslims. While in the deployment of the army and in making final preparations for battle, there was no hitch. The important problem which faced Saad was the tactical control of battle. He himself was immobilized by boils on his backside, which prevented him from sitting on a horse. In fact, they prevented him from sitting at all. He established his headquarters in the castle of Uzaib, and an arrangement was evolved whereby a deputy would be used to convey the orders of Saad to the unit commanders and to exercise control where Saad was unable to do so. This deputy was Khalid bin Urfuta, who took up his position below the wall of the castle. Saad placed himself on the wall nearest the battlefield, from where he could see virtually the entire battlefield. And from here he would throw down written notes to Khalid with orders, and Khalid would then execute the orders. For any battle action which Saad could not see, the deputy would take a decision himself and give orders as necessary. Saad had a cot placed on the battlements and lay prostrate upon it with a pillow under his chest, looking upon the plain where the two armies were formed up. He also kept at hand a whole platoon of aides, who would carry his orders direct to the commanders of corps and regiments, and would bring him reports about the course of battle. This was an alternative or supplementary arrangement to the command arrangement already described. When orders for deployment had been issued, Saad held a conference of his commanders at which he made a stirring speech about Allah and His blessings, about the need for valor and steadfastness, and ordered his officers to address the men and recite verses from the Quran before and during battle. He also explained his inability to be present with the men in battle because of his condition, and outlined the command arrangements which he had made. All understood and sympathized with him, except a few who uncharitably imputed unworthy motives to his remaining in the castle and commanding the army through a deputy. These officers included Jarir bin Abdullah, who passed rude remarks about the army commander to his comrades. When Saad came to know of his insubordination, he had him thrown into a dungeon and placed in fetters. But Jarir quickly repented and was as quickly pardoned and released. For the rest of the morning, the commanders went about their units reciting Quranic verses and urging the men to fight for Allah. Orators and poets fired the spirit of the men with eulogies on respective Arab tribes and clans, and the Muslim soldiery prepared with grim resolution for a battle which would undoubtedly decide the fate of Islam in Iraq. End of chapter 7.